Hello, Methodist Temple. In July, I am leading a virtual study every Wednesday about how we can read the Bible more responsibly. Now, of course, not everyone in our church has the time or ability to be a part of that particular study, but there's some material about the Bible that I've really been wanting to share with the class, but that we just aren't quite able to fit in. And so I thought that in a few short videos, one each week, I would share with all of our church a little bit extra about the Bible and how we read it. And so this week, we're going to be talking about a very, very brief history of biblical canonization. Now, canon comes from a Greek word which most literally means measuring stick. And so a canon is a group of texts of literary works that are used to measure all others. Think of a canon as the books or texts that have been deemed the most authoritative, the most important by a certain group of people. And so our biblical canon are those texts that we believe that God most wants us to read, those that are most holy, most sacred, most inspired by the Spirit. Not that other texts have no value at all, but that the ones that are in our Bible are the ones that we should measure all other texts against. But the Bible did not appear to us magically one day on a velvet pillow. It took time. It took human discernment and cooperation with the Spirit to arrive at the canon that we have today. Now, of course, that canonization process was in two parts because our Bible is in two parts: the Hebrew Bible, sometimes called the Old Testament, and the New Testament. The Hebrew Bible, and again, this is a very brief, oversimplified version of the history, basically came together at the end of the BC era and into the AD era. Of course, the texts were written starting as early as we think around 800 BC, but started coming together in an official recognized form by Jewish leadership around 200 BC in what was called the Septuagint. It was a Greek translation of something that is very similar to our modern Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. It had a few texts in it that we no longer include, but for the most part, this is when the Hebrew Bible comes together in an official recognized form. But it doesn't completely get finished until around 70 AD. So this is even after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, when it's completed by the Great Assembly, which is a centuries-long group of rabbis working together to finish this document. The New Testament, a little bit more complicated, at least from our perspective. Before about 100 AD, when the earliest Christians were talking about the scriptures, what they meant was the Jewish Septuagint, that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. There were lots of letters and gospels, accounts of Jesus' life circulating at that time. They were written by different leaders of the Christian movement, but none of them had been in any way officially recognized as the scriptures, the only ones that we should focus on or read in our church communities. It isn't until we get to about 200 AD that various bishops and church leaders start releasing lists of what they believe are the most authoritative texts. And what I find so interesting is that the main basis for what they saw as authoritative were those letters and gospels and narratives that were the most popular among everyday Christians. Every community had its own list of the texts that they believed were most inspired, but there were some texts that were popular among a great deal of communities, and those were the ones, for the most part, that began to be seen as authoritative, because they were the ones that were most useful, whether they be discipleship handbooks or letters written by Peter and Paul. In 393 AD is when you might say that we get an official New Testament and Hebrew Christian version of the Hebrew Bible, for that matter. A council under the leadership of St. Augustine and using mostly the list created by Athanasius, got together and said, this is our Christian scripture, and they closed the canon. Unless you're a Protestant, Martin Luther, all the way in 1522, decides to reopen the canon when he is writing his translation of the Bible into German. He takes out 7 books from the Hebrew Bible that we Protestants now refer to as the Apocrypha, or the deuterocanonical books. And he tried to take out some books from the New Testament, the letter to the Hebrews, the letter of Jude, the letter of James, and the book of Revelation, because he didn't believe that they were authoritative. But that didn't exactly catch on. So if you go and look at a Protestant Bible today, those New Testament books are still there. But what I find so fascinating about what Martin Luther did was that he showed us that the canon is not nearly as rigid as we might think it is. That as we move through time and context as a Christian community, we might start to think again about which biblical texts are most important, most sacred to us. And so I ask you to reflect today. If we reopened the canon, we called a new council to determine what should be in the Bible, what texts might you think about taking out? What texts might you add that have been written since 393 AD? And what would your measuring stick be for that which is inspired by God?